turned out I didn't get to work with her. Yeah, there was 0 scenes with Raphael and Britney Spears, probably at her request, because I had tweeted her I was going to bring...
The case has now reached a critical stage, with one final motion still hanging in the balance that could either be dismissed outright or move forward to trial. Blake has officially filed her opposition, while Wayfair has already submitted its response, setting up a key legal moment that could shape what happens next. Over the weekend there was a surge of developments, and although many are still catching up with the details, it's clear that further updates and deeper legal analysis are expected as the week unfolds. Looking back at what has already happened, one of the most notable decisions came when the court denied Tagg's motion, allowing the aiding and abetting claim to remain active. This outcome caught some observers off guard, especially considering the earlier arguments that focused on jurisdictional issues and geographic limitations. Despite those points, Judge Lyman chose not to dismiss the claim, signaling that he believes the allegations meet the threshold required to proceed at this stage of the case. That decision has become an important reference point, as it gives insight into how the judge may approach similar arguments moving forward. Because of that ruling, many began to speculate that the next motion might face a similar outcome. The reasoning was simple. If the judge was willing to allow one complex claim to proceed despite legal challenges, there was a strong possibility he might take a consistent approach with the remaining motion. This has made Blake's latest filing even more significant, as it directly responds to that pending issue. In her response, Blake addresses the motion for judgment on the pleadings, a legal request that can often be difficult to interpret due to its technical nature. However, when broken down, her argument becomes clear and appears strategically constructed. One of her central points is that there is no established case law that directly deals with the extraterritorial aspect of the harassment claims tied to retaliation. In other words, she argues that Wayfair is effectively asking the court to make a completely new legal determination, something that would set a precedent rather than follow one. This is where her argument gains strength. She highlights that Judge Lyman has already shown hesitation in creating new interpretations of California law while sitting in a federal court in New York. By emphasizing this, she frames Wayfair's request as something the judge is unlikely to entertain, reinforcing the idea that the motion should be denied rather than used as an opportunity to break new legal ground. Beyond that, Blake builds her case around the principle of reasonable good faith belief. She references a California Supreme Court decision to support the idea that a retaliation claim does not necessarily depend on whether the original conduct is ultimately proven to be a violation of the law. Instead, what matters is whether the employee genuinely and reasonably believed that the conduct was unlawful at the time it was reported. This distinction is important because it lowers the burden on the person making the complaint, focusing more on their perspective and intent rather than requiring them to prove a legal violation from the outset. She further strengthens this position by introducing a broader policy argument. According to her reasoning, employees should not be expected to possess the same level of legal knowledge as trained employment lawyers in order to determine whether they are protected when they report misconduct. The implication here is that requiring such expertise would discourage individuals from coming forward, ultimately undermining workplace protections. By framing it this way, she not only argues the legal technicalities, but also appeals to the practical realities of how workplace reporting functions. Altogether, her response combines legal precedent, judicial behavior, and policy considerations into a cohesive argument aimed at convincing the court to let the claim proceed. With the judge's previous ruling in mind, and the emphasis on avoiding the creation of new legal standards, this motion now stands as a pivotal moment that could determine whether the case narrows significantly or continues toward a full trial. Again, this comes across as a pretty strong set of arguments from Blake's side, especially when you look at the second major point she raises, the participation clause, which is arguably the most powerful part of her position. Unfair protection doesn't only apply to employees who oppose practices they believe are unlawful. It also clearly extends to those who formally participate in the complaint process itself. Blake emphasizes that she filed her CRD complaint in California on December 20th, and that action alone qualifies as protected activity under the statute. By framing it this way, she attempts to remove the complications around geography entirely. No territorial disputes, no New Jersey-related limitations, just a straightforward application of the law based on her filing. She further argues that Wayfair failed to address this critical portion of the statute in their original motion, essentially claiming that they are trying to win while ignoring half of the legal framework they themselves are relying on. From a non-legal perspective, this does seem convincing at first glance, especially when paired with the broader context of how the judge has been ruling so far. However, what stands out is how quickly Wayfair responded. They didn't delay, didn't wait to see how things would unfold. They moved almost immediately. That kind of speed suggests preparation rather than reaction. It gives the impression that they anticipated these arguments in advance and had their counterpoints ready to go, likely because they've been closely tracking the judge's previous decisions and trying to stay one step ahead. Their response introduces a different angle, focusing heavily on the policy implications of Blake's argument. They push back by suggesting that her interpretation would effectively turn California law into a nationwide enforcement tool for any company with ties to the state. In their view, if her argument were accepted, it would mean that companies headquartered in California could be held liable under California employment law for actions that take place entirely in other states, even if those actions are legal under those states' laws. They argue that courts generally avoid creating that kind of sweeping expansion, framing Blake's position as an overreach that goes beyond what the statute was ever intended to cover. They also take aim at the wording of the statute itself, arguing that it specifically refers to practices forbidden under FEHA, not practices that are merely similar or would hypothetically be forbidden if they occurred in California. According to Wayfair, Blake is effectively trying to rewrite the statute by expanding its scope beyond its actual language. On top of that, they bring up the long-standing legal principle regarding extraterritorial limits, pointing out that this interpretation has been settled in California law for decades. Their argument here is more pointed. They suggest that Blake's legal team, being California-based, should have been fully aware of these limitations, and therefore her claim of a reasonable good faith belief becomes harder to justify. But where things really take an interesting turn is in Wayfair's fallback position. Even while strongly arguing for dismissal, they introduce an alternative. If the court is not convinced to throw out the retaliation claim entirely, then it should at least be narrowed significantly. Specifically, they argue that any valid claim of retaliation should only apply to actions that occurred after Blake filed her formal complaint on December 20th. This is a strategic move, because it effectively draws a line in the timeline. Everything that may have happened before that date during the earlier months would no longer be relevant under that narrower interpretation. That shift could have major consequences. Much of the evidence and narrative that Blake appears to rely on communications, internal discussions, and alleged behind-the-scenes actions would potentially fall outside the scope of the claim if the court accepts this limitation. By focusing only on what happened after the filing, Wayfair reduces the case to a much smaller window of time, which could significantly weaken the overall impact of Blake's arguments. So, while Blake presents a strong and structured case, Wayfair's response shows a different kind of strategy, not just pushing for a complete win, but also preparing a backup plan that minimizes potential damage if the court doesn't fully agree with them. It turns the situation into a layered legal battle, where both sides are not only arguing their positions but also anticipating how the judge might rule and adjusting their strategies accordingly. At this stage, it almost feels like Wayfair is offering the court a kind of quiet, backdoor option that doesn't fully concede Blake's arguments, but still gives Judge Lyman a practical way to resolve the issue without going all in on either side. It's not being presented as a concession, but more as a strategic alternative. Even if the court isn't convinced to dismiss everything outright, there's still a narrower path that limits the scope of the claims. That kind of positioning can be very effective because it acknowledges the strength of the opposing arguments while still reinforcing their own stance as the stronger one. Looking at it from that angle, the move does seem smart. It gives the judge flexibility, which is often exactly what courts look for in complicated cases like this. Instead of forcing an all-or-nothing decision, Wayfair is essentially saying, "We believe we should win completely, but if not, here's a logical middle ground." And that middle ground, centered on the December 20th filing date, carries a lot of weight when you think about the timeline of events. From their perspective, it also raises a practical question. Why would there have been any effort to damage Blake's reputation before that complaint was even filed? Especially during the film's release period when things appeared to be going well publicly. The project was reportedly successful, audiences were responding positively, and there didn't seem to be an obvious incentive to create internal conflict at that point. By highlighting that timeline, Wayfair strengthens its argument that any claim of retaliation should logically be tied to actions occurring after the formal complaint, not before. They also lean into the idea that Blake's legal argument stretches the law beyond its intended meaning, suggesting she is effectively trying to reshape how the statute is interpreted. That criticism isn't just legal, it's rhetorical, aiming to frame her position as overreaching rather than grounded in established precedent. It's a way of undermining credibility while reinforcing their own interpretation as more consistent with how the law has traditionally been applied. What makes the situation more complicated is how uncertain the outcome now feels. Earlier, there was a sense based on legal analysis and reactions to previous rulings that the case might lean strongly in one direction. But as more filings come in and both sides refine their arguments, that clarity has faded. It's no longer easy to predict. There was even a point where it seemed like dismissal was likely, which would have meant a technical victory without necessarily addressing the underlying allegations in a meaningful way. That kind of outcome can feel unsatisfying because it resolves the case procedurally rather than substantively. Now, with this new strategy in play, the balance has shifted again. If the court accepts Wayfair's narrower interpretation, it could significantly reduce the scope of the case, possibly even removing key elements that would have supported a broader claim. At the same time, if the judge rejects that limitation, the case could move forward in a much larger form than Wayfair would prefer. That's why it feels so evenly split at this point. The timing also adds another layer of intensity. With a pre-trial hearing just days away, the speed of these filings starts to make more sense. Both sides are clearly trying to position themselves as strongly as possible before the court makes its next move. Wayfair's quick response suggests they were fully prepared for this moment, anticipating the arguments and planning their counter-strategy in advance. So now the big question is whether this case actually makes it to the courtroom as scheduled or gets resolved before that point. What once seemed relatively predictable now feels genuinely uncertain. There's a real possibility it could still be dismissed, but there's also a strong chance it proceeds in some form. At this stage, it's difficult to lean too heavily in either direction. The odds feel almost evenly balanced. As more analysis comes in and legal experts weigh these arguments, the picture may become clearer. For now though, this remains a developing situation, with both sides presenting layered strategies and the court holding the final say on how far this case will go. At this point, it's a really interesting development because when you step back and look at it objectively, both sides are presenting genuinely strong arguments. Blake came back with a solid response that, to be fair, holds weight in several areas, especially in how she framed the legal protections and avoided some of the jurisdictional pitfalls. But then Wayfair followed up with a sharp counter, almost like a final uppercut, and on top of that, they introduced that strategic out for the judge. That combination makes their response feel especially calculated and effective, as if they're not just arguing to win outright but also guiding the court toward a fallback position that still benefits them. What makes all of this harder to predict is Judge Lyman himself. He's been somewhat difficult to read throughout the process. At one point it almost felt like he was signaling to the parties to refine their arguments, especially by pointing out areas that hadn't been fully addressed. That gave the impression he might be leaning in a particular direction, or at least leaving the door open for certain motions to succeed. So when he decided to keep the aiding and abetting claim alive, it genuinely came as a surprise. It showed that he's not necessarily following the path people expected, which adds even more uncertainty to how he might rule next. Even if the retaliation claim ends up being dismissed, the fact that the aiding and abetting claim could remain changes the dynamic significantly. It means the case wouldn't just disappear, it would still move forward in some capacity, potentially leading to a more detailed and revealing court process. In a way, that could make things even more compelling because it opens the door to deeper examination, including expert analysis and more thorough scrutiny of the underlying events. That's where the internal conflict comes in. On one hand, there's a desire for a clear and final resolution, something that definitively settles the matter. But on the other hand, if the case is dismissed purely on a technical basis, such as jurisdiction or geography, it doesn't fully resolve the narrative. It leaves room for continued debate outside the courtroom. From a public perception standpoint, that kind of outcome can be frustrating because it allows one side to argue that they were never truly heard, that the decision wasn't about the facts but about legal technicalities. And realistically, if that happens, it's likely the story doesn't end there. From a PR perspective, a dismissal on technical grounds can be framed in a way that keeps the controversy alive. It creates space for ongoing claims that the process was unfair or incomplete, which can continue shaping public opinion long after the legal case is closed. On the flip side, if the case goes to trial and reaches a jury, the outcome carries a different kind of weight. A jury decision, regardless of which way it goes, feels more definitive, because it's based on a full examination of the evidence rather than procedural limitations. For someone seeking to fully clear their name, that kind of resolution can be far more impactful. It removes the ambiguity and replaces it with a clear conclusion that's harder to reinterpret. So the best case scenario really depends on perspective. A quick dismissal might bring immediate closure in a legal sense, but it could leave lingering questions in the public sphere. A trial, while more drawn out and uncertain, offers the possibility of a more complete resolution that addresses the substance of the claims rather than just the structure of the law. As things stand, it's understandable to feel torn. The situation has become less predictable, and both outcomes carry their own advantages and drawbacks. With the upcoming hearing just around the corner, the next decision could significantly shape the direction of the case, either narrowing it down further or pushing it toward a much larger and more public courtroom battle.